Video game coaching is seeing a boom during the coronavirus pandemic. Fox Business Network Cheryl Casone has more.
It is a billion-dollar business and it's getting bigger. Video game coaching has exploded over the last few months during the pandemic as esports programs have increased in colleges and major tournaments have emerged around the world, online, not in person. Online marketplace 5RR.com saw a 43% jump in the number of coaching sessions booked between January and March as much of the world shut down. In March, another company, Gamer Coach, sold more than 1,000 hours of virtual coaching, up from 650 hours in February. In fact, Gamer Coach is fielding about 10 applications a day from people that want to sign up to be coaches. And these coaches can make up to $25 an hour these days. That's a $10 boost since before the coronavirus. The games themselves vary, whether it's Fortnite, Rainbow Six Siege, or Overwatch. That's a multiple player shooting competition. These coaches usually have other jobs, but a dozen hours a week of coaching has become their new normal in addition to their regular gig. And as millions file for unemployment benefits across the country, many are starting to see online esports competition as not a hobby, but a career. And platforms like Google-owned YouTube are benefiting from that trend. In New York, Cheryl Casone, Fox Business.